So, welcome everyone. I'm Barbara Mezes, and I've recently finished my PhD at the Spectrum Center for Mental Health Research. And I'm here today to present some of the key findings of this project, along with Nadia Akers, who is currently a PhD student and, at Spectrum Center for Mental Health Research. So my PhD looked at exploring personal recovery in bipolar disorder, and Nadia is currently learning about what can help people with bipolar disorder to function well in their lives. First of all, we would like to thank our supervisors for their ongoing support and encouragement, and also our funders. So both of our studentships have been funded by the Faculty of Health and Medicine at Lancaster University. So as been mentioned today, recovery in mental health has two key meanings. The first one is clinical recovery, which is often defined by professionals as symptom reduction, relapse prevention, and these are still important aspects of recovery. However, service users often emphasize other things in their recovery experiences, such as empowerment, living a meaningful and fulfilling life, and also functioning successfully in both their professional and personal lives. And so this is called personal recovery, and the idea of focusing on these other aspects of recovery has emerged from the recovery movement we started in the 1980s. And this individual process of personal recovery is often described using a journey metaphor.
When the book goes by, it gets a bit hard to hear, so just try and shout a bit.
So therapies and research are primarily focused on clinical outcomes, despite the recognised importance of service user-defined outcomes. These personal recovery outcomes are also reflected in the government's mental health strategy and the NICE clinical guidelines for the treatment of bipolar disorder. The reason why it's so important to look at these other outcomes is that there are often different trajectories of clinical and personal outcomes. For example, some people are able to sustain good social relationships, a successful career, and a personally meaningful life while still potentially experiencing high levels of symptoms. There are some well-known examples of people who have or are thought to have had bipolar-relevant mood experiences who have actually excelled in their professional lives. For example, Stephen Fry, who's a well-known presenter and comedian, and Winston Churchill, who obviously had a leadership role in politics. So our PhD projects both follow a similar structure, so we're going to be talking about them together. And we both started by systematically reviewing the available literature in the topic of interest. Barbara's review looked at predictors of personal recovery in bipolar disorder and found that in general the quality of the literature out there was quite weak, so no conclusions on predictors could actually be made based on the available literature. She did identify the gap in the literature that psychological processes, for example, how people think about their experiences, have not been extensively examined in relation to personal recovery in bipolar disorder. My functioning review is looking at how common higher functioning is in bipolar disorder, because there's limited research about how people actually live well with a diagnosis. So my review found that there was actually a considerable variability in functioning, and overall around 16% of people within the literature actually had excellent levels of functioning. The review also identified that many of the current measures of functioning were actually assessing impairments in functioning, so they weren't able to capture the higher levels that some people were actually demonstrating. So to address the gaps in the literature, we both conducted a questionnaire study. Barbara recruited 107 participants with bipolar disorder to look at whether the way people think actually plays an important role in personal recovery in bipolar disorder, and whether these thinking styles can actually help explain changes in personal recovery over time. My functioning study is using previously collected data that was collected for the Parade psychoeducation trial, which was a large-scale clinical trial looking at the effects of psychoeducation versus treatment as usual in a sample of 304 participants with bipolar disorder over a 2-year period. So I'm looking at this data to see whether there are any clinical or demographic characteristics that can predict higher functioning over time, and the analysis for my study is currently ongoing at the moment. So the final phase of both of our PhD projects involves a qualitative interview study. Barbara selected 21 participants from her questionnaire study who had either low, medium or high levels of personal recovery. I'm also aiming to interview around 20 people with bipolar disorder, and I'm looking for people who believe that they're flourishing alongside their mood experiences. So my interview study is actually aiming to answer similar questions to the ones that Barbara looked at. However, I'm looking at them in terms of functioning rather than recovery. So what we're interested in is to understand more about how people define and experience higher functioning and personal recovery, and whether the way people score on questionnaires actually has an effect on the way that they talk about their experiences. We're also interested in understanding more about what people think supports or hinders their recovery and functioning. So I'm currently looking for people to take part in my study on higher functioning. There are some flyers dotted around the room, so feel free to take one if you're interested, or if you know somebody who might be interested in taking part, and I'll also be around to answer any questions. Okay.
So, as Nadia mentioned, the functioning study is still ongoing, but there are some early results from Nadia's questionnaire study showing that people who had higher achievements in schools and in their careers had also higher rates of social functioning. The results of my recovery study show that how people experience recovery varies greatly. So there are people who scored in my questionnaire study low on the personal recovery questionnaire. They talked about their recovery experience in line with the clinical views on recovery, and they emphasized that recovery was a passing state which they experienced between mood episodes. On the other hand, people who scored higher on the recovery questionnaire, for them, clinical recovery was a basis for working towards their personal recovery aims, such as improving self-acceptance and developing resilience to cope with challenges in their lives. Moreover, both of our studies found that depressive symptoms, the level of depressive symptoms experienced by people, were important in both personal recovery and functioning. So in my study, higher rates of depressive symptoms were related to lower personal recovery, while in Nadia's studies it was linked to lower functioning. In addition, my study also found that how people respond to depressive symptoms was also important. So not only the level of depressive symptoms, but how people react to these experiences. For example, seeing depressive experiences as personal characteristics as opposed to being due to difficult circumstances, and thinking about goals and achievements in an unhelpful way was related to lower personal recovery. So an example of this unhelpful thinking might be setting unrealistic goals or trying to overachieve in everything they undertake. In contrast, active coping or trying actively resolving problems as they arise, challenging negative thoughts, and engaging in meaningful and relaxing activities was related to better personal recovery when these were exercised as part of a response to their depressive experiences. Because we used open questions in the qualitative interviews, we were able to learn more about other things that were important to people in their recovery journey. For example, being in employment or being physically healthy. Some people found meaning in religion and spirituality, while others emphasized the importance of normalizing their mood experiences, which means accepting that everyone experiences low and high mood and is not necessarily a sign of becoming unwell.
So we believe this research is really important because it highlights that individual experiences are so unique and varied that measures need to be designed and used to capture these higher levels of functioning and broader recovery experiences. The results from Barbara's study are actually in line with the 5-year forward view for mental health, which highlights the effect of physical health and employment. However, a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to be beneficial for everyone. Instead, recovery plans, psychological interventions and mental health services should have an individualised, flexible and holistic approach to recovery.
Yes, so based on the results of my recovery study, psychological interventions could improve personal recovery by supporting occupational and social functioning, also monitoring how people think about goals and achievements, and also helping people to accept their mood experiences as ups and downs of everyday life, and learn or try to teach people not to be self-critical and foster self-acceptance. Moreover, advocating problem and emotion-focused coping strategies may also be beneficial as part of psychological interventions. For example, solving problems as they arise one by one, or using distraction techniques such as relaxation and exercise.